Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar titled Mastics, Mortars, and Now Adhesives. I'm Jim Olson with the National Tile Contractors Association. I want to welcome you and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and busy day to attend today's webinar sponsored by TEC HB Fuller. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to remind you that during the webinar, you will be muted. Please use the questions area on your computer to type in your questions, and we'll answer those questions at the end of this presentation. If the audio on your computer is poor, call the number on the invite to this webinar and listen on your phone. All NTCA webinars are available to watch at any time on the NTCA YouTube channel shortly after the webinars are presented. This gives you easy access to watch and or share all current and past programs at your convenience. All right, I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Heather Ruhl, National Technical Manager for HB Fuller Tech, was promoted to National Technical Manager of the Flooring Division of HB Fuller Construction Products last year. She has been with HB Fuller since 2016, serving as a training manager for the division while focusing on contractor training and social media content development. With a BS degree in chemical engineering and an MBA in business administration, Heather is poised for a successful career in our industry. I'm excited to say Heather was recently recognized as the rock star in this past April's covering show and is our first rock star to present on the NTCA webinars. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully I can live up to what I feel like was a pretty major hype there from Jim. So thank you guys all for joining us. We're going to talk today about basically a lot of different adhesives in this industry, what the differences are, what the standards are, and what you can expect from each of these different types of products, titled Mastics, Mortars, and Now Adhesives. So let's talk about the different, where are we getting the information that we have, right? We really like to rely on industry standards. So things like the TCNA handbook, the Tile Council of North America handbook, ANSI standards, right? That's kind of the meat and potatoes of a lot of what we do here in the US. We also get a lot of information from the Marble Institute of America. And this is an NTCA webinar, so I would be remiss not to mention the National Tile Contractors Association's reference manual, plus building codes and manufacturers. There is one other organization that I really like to bring up because I don't think we talk about it much in the United States. It's called ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization. We can all laugh a little bit that in English, that's a very funny way to put it. You'd think it would be iOS, but it is ISO, even though it's the International Organization for Standardization. And that's kind of like the international version of ANSI. So when you think about standards for materials and products, in the US, we default a lot to ANSI because it's the US standard. Internationally, they default a lot to ISO. So if you were to go overseas, they probably wouldn't refer to an ANSI standard, they would refer to the ISO standard. Today, we're going to talk very specifically about one particular standard, which is 14448. I always mess up how many fours are in that. There are 3, and that was published back in 2014. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between the adhesive types that we have, all right? Let's talk about what we all know, or what hopefully we're all very familiar with, right? That's Mastics and Mortars. A little bit of a comparison and contrast here. Mastics are organic adhesives, right? That's exactly what they're wet, they're ready to use in a bucket. Mortars, on the other hand, are cementitious, right? That means that mastics are water-based. In order to stick 2 things together, a mastic has to dry. Mortars, on the other hand, have a chemical cure. Because of that, you're going to have a lot more limitations with mastics. They're going to be interior only. You're not going to be able to submerge them. And the other thing is they have to dry, which means if you take let's say a porcelain tile, which is pretty much impervious, let's say for the sake of this discussion, and you put it over a waterproofing membrane and you think that's going to be able to stick, right? You can imagine that if that has to dry and you basically sandwich it between 2 plastic sheets, it will never dry on the inside. And this is something that I do think is worth pointing out because years ago, the methods for installing in showers didn't necessarily include a waterproofing membrane the way they do now. They included cement board and vapor barriers, and there were other options. Now, a lot of showers that are going in wet areas, they use that waterproofing membrane. So if you try using Mastics in those areas, you're not going to have a good time, okay? So that's where mortars come in. Mortars, they're cementitious. They have chemical cures. Depending on which mortar you're using, you could, often use them for interior or exterior applications, submerged applications, and for use over those waterproofing membranes. Then let's also talk about size limitations. Again, Mastics have to dry. If you get a tile that's big enough, they're going to have a hard time drying out underneath, right? So Mastics oftentimes have all those limitations of places that you can or can't use them, right? Mortars, on the other hand, I mean, I'll be honest, I'm at a gauge porcelain panel training event today. There's almost no size limitation. I mean, we're setting 1 meter by 3 meter panels today. You can use them for 5 foot by 10 foot panels. Mortars can do a lot more than Mastics can. Now let's talk about the actual specifications, right? You have a type 1 and a type 2 adhesive. Basically, the way to think about it is the type 1 you can use in a lot more areas. It's got a little bit higher performance. There's more limitations with the type 2. Let's talk about those limitations. I always like visuals, right? So I've given you all these places you can't use a Mastic. You can't use it in a swimming pool. You can't use it in a lot of shower applications. Where can you use it? Why would anybody want to use a Mastic? Well, one of the best places to use Mastics, honestly, is going to be in backsplash type applications, right? The advantage to a Mastic is it's ready to use in a bucket. You could walk into a house, set it down on the countertop, and you're ready to set tile, right? There's no mixing, none of that other fun stuff that goes with it. So there is a place for it, but there's also a lot of limitations. And given the fact that I think the average tile size nowadays is far bigger than it was when Mastics were maybe a little bit more popular, a little bit long, maybe 10, 15 years ago, you have to realize that part of the reason a lot of people have gotten away from Mastics is they just don't work as well with those big tile. But again, they still have their place. Backsplashes, smaller tile, areas that don't have a lot of water exposure, they're really, really easy to use. Just open it up and you're ready to go. What about mortar specifications? Mortars have different ANSI specifications. And as I said, depending on which specification it meets, you can use it in different areas, right? So it goes from a 0.1 mortar, an A118.1, which is an unmodified mortar. That means there's no latex, there's no polymer modification in it, all the way up to an ANSI A118.15, all right? Those A118.15s are incredibly high performance products. They have incredible bond strengths. Within these standards, we also have extra designations that you could also meet. Things like a heavy tile, you could add an A118.15H, right? And so that's a mortar that's specifically designed to hold up those heavier tile, right? You could also have an A118.15E, which means it's an extended open time. You could have an A118.15HE, which is both. Extended open time, right, basically means that from when you trowel it out until you set your tile, you have a longer time that mortar stays tacky. We also have a fast setting product, which basically means your final set is less than about 3 hours. And then T stands for thixotropic, which means it's non-sag. That basically means if you stick your tile on the wall, it's not going to slide down. But also if you put it, if you stick your tile to the floor, you're not going to see an edge that kind of, sinks a little bit just due to the weight of the tile. So there's a lot of specifications that we deal with every day, and making sure that you're choosing the right product for your application is critical. Let's talk about where can you use these mortars. I mentioned it earlier. There's a lot more places that you can use mortar, right? So again, you can use it on the larger tile. You can use it over waterproofing membranes, but you do still have to mix it, right? There is still a mixing application, which oftentimes means there's OSHA regulations for silica. You have to be controlling your dust. You have to be controlling what you're breathing in and the dust you're creating. And there's a few more environmental controls, in addition to the fact that you need a water source. You need to make sure that you have electricity to be able to run your drills, right? So while they're a lot more versatile, they do kind of have the downside that you're still mixing, you're still having to deal with the potential silica exposure, right? And that's just something you have to kind of plan around nowadays for mortar. So there's got to be a better way. And there is, Kevin. So when we started thinking through, all the downsides that you end up with mortars around the mixing and the application, just those types of things. It seemed like there has to be a way that we could combine the convenience of Mastics with the versatility that you have with mortars. All right. So one of the ways that you can do that is you've got something called an MS adhesive. MS adhesives are modified silanes. These are reactive adhesives. So notice I didn't say organic adhesives like we would say for Mastics. These are reactive adhesives that require no mixing and are ready to use in the bucket. Typically, they don't have all the same limitations that you end up with Mastics, right? So you can use them for a wide variety of applications. In the United States, most MS adhesives are wood adhesives. So if we were to go over and ask a wood guy, right, or someone that does a lot of wood flooring about what MS adhesive he used, a lot of them would have a favorite, or they would be able to tell you about MS adhesives. But here in the US, most of the time we don't see these types of adhesives cross over into tile. Those that do produce these types of adhesives for tile applications, they're basically proprietary, right? They're proprietary. They're something that one specific manufacturer might make, and they might give you instructions for what you should do to apply these types of products. With that, there's no existing ANSI standard for these types of tile adhesives, right? So there's not, I couldn't go and pull up a book and tell you, hey, if you're using an MS adhesive here in the US, here's the ANSI standard related to it. Here's how you should be applying it. Here's what you should be doing. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about what modified silane adhesives are. MS adhesives were originally developed in Japan in the 1970s. The goal with them was actually to put them around earthquake-resistant buildings. And again, these are chemically reactive adhesives. So these are adhesives that instead of mixing them with water, they actually react with moisture in the air, okay? So if you're in a high humidity environment, this adhesive will actually automatically on its own start reacting with that moisture in the air, and that's what's going to give you that final cure, which is the opposite of, say, a mastic. Mastics, you need the moisture to leave. With these MS adhesives, you want to bring the moisture in so that they can start to react, all right? Believe it or not, there is a standard that exists for this. It's just not an ANSI standard. The official standard is an ISO standard. It is an ISO 14448, which the very technical term is a low modulus adhesive for exterior tile finishing, all right? This testing includes a lot of pretty intense stuff. We're gonna test the adhesive strength in standard conditions, low temperature curing, alkaline warm water immersion, freeze-thaw cycles, heat aging. We're also going to check the heat stability and, similar to the ANSI standards, slip resistance, open time. And then they also do some testing because this is more of a film. So instead of like a mortar where it cures and it's somewhat brittle, this is almost more like a crack isolation product. It's not, but it kind of has more of the feel of that once it's cured, that it does have a little bit of play to it or flex. Just to give you an idea, standard curing conditions are very similar to ANSI standards, right? You're going to be curing these things in 75-degree Fahrenheit temperatures with about a 50% relative humidity, for about 672 hours, give or take, right? But after that, things kind of start to get interesting, okay? I'm going to start by just showing you guys what some of this testing looks like. So when you're testing, this is kind of some of the setups that you might do. You're going to apply your adhesive to your tile. And then typically what you're going to do is you're going to stick them to a concrete block, okay? So this is kind of the standard curing conditions. So we would typically trowel this out. You would set your tile down, and you would allow it to cure at that 50% relative humidity, 75 degrees for a good period of time. But of course, because this is a little bit more intense of a test, we also are going to do things like, put it in the refrigerator. So we actually will also put it into a low temperature curing application, which basically means that you're taking that product and you're cooling it down and seeing what happens to the cure while you're, leaving it in a very low temperature condition. We don't just, test for low temperature, but we also test for what happens if you immerse it in water. Okay. And that actually brings me to one of, I think, the coolest tests that is part of this ISO standard, which is freeze-thaw stability. So when you do freeze-thaw stability, you put it in a freezer. That seems obvious. Most people might think, oh, you know, stick it in a freezer, take it out a few times, kind of go from there, right? It's a little bit more intense than that. With this freeze-thaw stability test, you install under standard condition, and then you soak it in water for 24 hours. And then you freeze it, thaw it, soak it in water, and repeat 200 times. So when we say that these types of adhesives are really good for exterior, it's no joke. Part of the standard legitimately includes soaking it, freezing it, thawing it, soaking it, freezing it, thawing it, right? Over 200 times. We also will do heat aging, which basically means that you're going to install it and allow it to age in very high temperature conditions, or I shouldn't say very, but relatively high temperature conditions. And again, we're going to see, can we pass the minimum bond strengths that are required for that type of aging or for that type of a test, all right? Next thing that they also test is something that I think we're all hopefully very familiar with. It is the slip test. And the left-hand picture is a photo of one of these slip tests that just shows the tile, and then you get a nice up-close picture there on the right-hand side. I want you guys to notice the slip test basically is no slip. That's kind of where you end up with this adhesive, that there really isn't much slip allowed there. So very tight tolerances, which means typically these adhesives have quite a bit of body to them. We also do elongation testing. We kind of joke, these are called dog bones. And basically what you're able to do is you'll trowel out the adhesive, basically kind of flat trowel it, for lack of a better way to describe it. And then you'll cut out these dog bones. And then you'll put it in a pull test, which basically allows you to pull it apart and see what happens as you move it. When does it break? How much will it, expand? How far can you take it, right? So this just kind of gives you an idea of, it's not an ANSI standard, but it is an ISO standard that kind of describes what type of exterior tile adhesives you can use. And because it's got such an intense and kind of a relatively strict standard for that it has to meet, you can use it a lot of different places, right? You can use it with a lot of different tiles. You can use it in places that you wouldn't normally be able to use, a traditional adhesive. And it's definitely somewhere that you wouldn't be able to use a mastic, all right? So with that in mind, let's go back to our comparison that we did earlier between mortars and mastics. When we think about the ISO-based standard, we're thinking about a reactive adhesive, okay? It's polymer-based. When we're thinking about mortars, cementitious. Both adhesive and mortars have a chemical cure. However, mortars, you as the installer have to mix with water, right? With the reactive adhesives, they're going to react with moisture in the air. So if you're in a really high humidity environment, I'm down in Kentucky this week in the summer, it gets humid down here, right? You're going to find that those types of adhesives are going to react faster with the moisture in the air versus if you were in somewhere dry, for example, like Arizona. Okay, these types of ISO adhesives can be submerged. You can use them over waterproofing membranes. And notice, very similar to mortars, virtually no size limitations. But a critical difference, adhesives versus mortar, is again, mortar, you have to mix, okay? Often that means that you're going to be dealing with silica dust, or you're going to have some type of a containment action because of that. And also you're going to have an extra guy on the site that is spending time mixing mortar, right? Where with the adhesives, it is ready to go, ready to use in the bucket, and you're basically opening it and you're moving, all right? Now let's compare these adhesives to mastics. A lot of the pluses that you get with mastics are the same as with these adhesives, but without a lot of the downsides. So again, adhesive, it's going to be polymer based, mastic, it's going to be an organic adhesive. It's going to need water that has to dry. You're only going to be able to use it inside, where these adhesives are literally designed for exterior use. Mastics, you can't use them over waterproofing. You couldn't use them in pools. They have size limitations, but they're ready to use in the bucket. And same thing with adhesives. It's ready to use in the bucket without a lot of those downsides. So a lot of times people might think, all right, all that's going on, but what about the application differences? How is it different from using a traditional, mastic or using a traditional mortar? These products are ready to use in a bucket, okay? So you literally go in, you open the bucket, and the adhesive is ready to use. There's no mixing. So again, it sounds very similar to a mastic. Here's where it's a little bit different. On top of all these adhesives, there's going to be some type of a plastic film that is a moisture protectant, okay? So it is going to help protect the product from any moisture in the air, because when you fill a bucket up, normally there's a little bit of headspace, right? And you want to make sure that if there's any moisture in that headspace, it doesn't get into your adhesive, right? Because when it does, it's going to start reacting. So a lot of people might ask, well, what happens if I leave the bucket open and it starts reacting with the moisture in the air? Can I still use the adhesive, or do I have to throw the whole bucket away? The answer is sometimes the mortar does start to skin over on the surface because it's reacting with the moisture in the air. All you got to do is peel that kind of surface layer off, peel that kind of skin, that adhesive skin off, and the adhesive that's underneath that skin is still good to go. Do yourself a favor, do not mix it in with the remaining product. That's reacted or cured product. You don't want to mix that in with unreacted and uncured product. You want to remove that film and throw it away. Oftentimes, you're going to be able to do a one-sided adhesive application. These are very sticky products. They have quite a bit of grab, right? So you're not really going to have too many issues with having, again, to worry about it slipping or sliding. You do, of course, have to make sure that you are getting properly prepared substrates. You guys probably know, but I'll just offer it as a reminder, an 1/8 in 10 variation is allowable in a substrate, and no more than a 1/16 in 2 feet, provided you're installing large format tile, which again, let's be honest, that's pretty much everything that people are installing. Here's the difference between these MS and moisture cure adhesives and a traditional mastic or a mortar. They're moisture curing, right? Which basically means that you need moisture to cure. So I kind of think of this as kind of a nice feature because, you know, with mortars, you're somewhat at the mercy of when they want to finish reacting or the time frame that that chemical cure, you know, kind of is created, right? So with these MS adhesives, when you add moisture to it, you're basically saying, start reacting now, okay? So one of the things you can do is you can actually spritz the surface of the adhesive, or if you're going over an absorptive substrate, you can wipe it down with a lightly dampened sponge and give it a surface saturated dry, right? And that's a great practice with mortars as well. In the summer, you know, a lot of times you guys know that if it's hot, giving your substrate a drink is never a bad idea. With this, if you give your substrate a drink, all you're doing is you're telling the adhesive, start reacting as soon as you come in contact with that moisture. So it's a little bit different, and it's a little bit different way to think about it. But when you just, good way to remember it is it needs that moisture to react. So you're giving it that moisture and telling it it's time to react now. So what do you do next? Install your tile, right? And as they always said in all of those Staples commercials, that was easy, okay? It's really not that much different from what you might be used to with a mortar or a mastic. It's just kind of combining a lot of the best of both worlds with this type of standard. So talking a little bit about products that do meet those ISO standards, we have our Total Flex XMS, which is our modified silane tile adhesive, which meets the ISO 14448. All of the things that we just kind of talked about, exactly what this product is designed to do, right? It's ready to use, there's no mixing, one-sided application. Something that's really cool with this is you've got a wider application window. Because that ISO standard allows for a little bit cooler installation, you're actually checking the cure with cooler installations. It's a lot more forgiving, where with normal traditional cementitious products, you're gonna have to be installing between 50 and 60 degrees, right? So kind of some things to think about, that's kind of the difference that you're gonna get using these ISO adhesives versus using a traditional mortar. That open time and the repositioning time, all that's kind of written up in the ISO standard, so I'm not gonna get too nitty gritty into it. And the really cool thing is suitable substrates, there's a lot of them when you get into this. It sticks to pretty much everything. Using these adhesives is going to allow you to minimize weight and application thickness, temperature limitations, and again, labor costs, okay? So if you're comparing traditional mortars to adhesives, you're going to be saving labor, you're going to be saving total weight, and also the fact that you're not dealing with, again, the downside of mortars, which is water, electricity, or dust generation, right? Just something to consider as you're deciding between what types of technologies you want to use. It's also going to be how many people are you going to have to invest in. One of the ways I like to kind of talk about how different products can be used and the advantages to using, again, a tile adhesive like this versus a traditional mortar is to show you guys an actual case study of an application that we've done. I like to joke that we're helping one penguin at a time. One of the first jobs we did with this type of product was the Detroit Zoo penguin enclosure. And it was an area where cool temperatures and high humidity would have been challenging for traditional mortars. I don't know if you guys know, penguins don't really like high temperatures, not all of them, I should say. So this was an area that would have been a challenge for a traditional product, but going in with these types of products that have wider temperature ranges and allow you to install at a lower temperature, closer to that 40-degree mark versus 50 to 60, is really advantageous. It's also advantageous when you're thinking about, I live in the Chicagoland area, I do a lot of work in the Midwest. It can be challenging doing exterior installations when you start looking at, all the way probably February to, let's say, May. You could have a snowstorm at any point in time during that. And if you're dealing with traditional mortars, the things you have to be thinking about as far as tenting off the area and making sure it's heated, it can be pretty intense. Using an adhesive like this gives you a little bit more wiggle room on how cool it can get overnight. You still can't get below freezing, and I should make that very clear. This isn't, using these types of adhesive isn't a free pass to just let things freeze overnight, but it does give a little bit more wiggle room than you might see with a traditional cementitious product. So let's talk about these advanced adhesives, and kind of, in my opinion, I think this is where a lot of the tile world is going, and it's because of things like changing code. Okay, this was taken directly from the 2021 IBC 1404.10.2, which says that, traditionally you needed to anchor in any exterior tile because traditionally exterior tile were very, very heavy, right? They were very thick. Then, well, let's say maybe 7 or 8 years ago in the US, we started getting more and more of these gauge porcelain panels that were lighter weight. So they're starting to actually change some of the codes that you can install these panels outside without a mechanical fastening, provided they meet these two standards. You can glue it in, provided it's no more than 3.5 pounds per square foot and not more than 48 inches on any one side, or has a face dimension more than 9 square feet. Or if you're less than 3.5 pounds, you can put in quite a bit bigger tile without having to anchor them in. For reference, I mean, the 3.5 mil tile, I believe they're less than 2 pounds a square foot. So when you start talking about gauged porcelain panels, they meet that lower weight requirement, right? And having the ability to adhere tile to an exterior building is something that it's a critical thing, because it's a lot of labor savings, and it's a lot easier than having to mechanically fasten every single tile. And I think we all know tiles are getting bigger, right? We're not installing 4.25 wall tile anymore, and a 12 by 12 isn't big. Tiles are getting bigger and bigger every year. And I mean, like I said, we're installing 5 foot by 10 foot panels on a semi-regular basis. And I would also make the argument that it's not just porcelain tiles that are getting bigger, right? You're also dealing with glass tiles that are getting bigger and bigger every year. And at some point that can become very challenging for traditional products, right? Traditional mortars might struggle with some of the larger glass panels just due to the expansion and contraction. I know that, in our product lineup, there are some things that we might allow to bond to glass, but we would never allow to bond to glass that gets as big as some of the things that we're seeing on the market right now. So it's not just the porcelain that we're thinking about, but you also have to start considering that, it's also glass tile that can get really, really big, and having an adhesive that you can use to actually bond those or bond it to an exterior is going to become something that I think is more and more important as time goes on, just because everything's getting bigger, right? Not just the porcelain. With that, I would like to thank you for taking the time, a little half hour to spend with me and talk about the different technologies and the ISO standards that exist. Here's kind of some contact information. If you guys ever have any questions, comments, concerns, you can go ahead and give us a call. As Jim mentioned at the beginning of this, manage our technical team. And so I strongly encourage, if you guys ever have any technical questions, you're not sure about something, we love getting questions. We love talking to people. It's one of the, even though it's a 1-800 number, you're going to talk to a team of people that really knows what they're doing. And again, I strongly encourage you, if you ever got any questions, concerns, let us know. Thank you again, and I appreciate everyone's time.
Sorry about that. I got delayed a little bit there. Couldn't get my computer on. So I want to thank you and thank all the attendees. We had a real good attendance today and very exciting. A lot of great news. And Heather, I'm glad you went into ISO and showed the comparison between ISO and ANSI and how that works, because it is kind of becoming a crossover across the world. So that's fantastic. And I want to just thank everyone for attending. We've got a few questions here if you're ready to go.
Let's see, let's go.
All right, the first one I didn't really understand, and maybe you do. Interested in skids of pressure-sensitive adhesives. Do you know what that means?
Yeah, pressure-sensitive adhesives are typically adhesives used in the vinyl or the resilient flooring world. So I would say it's a little bit different from what we presented on today, but if you've got questions about it, you can either reach out to technical support hotline or reach out to me and we can kind of figure out which product you're looking for, but it's a little bit out in my experience outside of the tile installation world.
Yeah, I get that. Okay, that's great. And before I forget, I should let all of our attendees know, one of the things that we always mention is that manufacturers' recommendations supersede anything from ISO, from NTC, from TCNA, NTCA reference manual. Always read the recommendations and everything on the manufacturer's literature. It's very important. So
I'll
definitely
add to that. That's typically, I always make the joke that manufacturers are the one offering the warranty, not TCNA.
That's right.
Right?
They're the ones going to take care of you.
Right, exactly. So if you're following our directions, whether it's TEC or any of the other manufacturers, if you're following our directions, we're going to be able to work with you, or
Exactly.
industry standards. I should say that, you can always default to industry standards, but in the end, we're the ones that are writing the warranty. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Definitely want to follow their instructions for sure. All right. What is the issue with glass tile mortars and large format glass tiles?
Yeah, so it can be a challenge. I'll give an example. We have our adhesive, excuse me, now I've got adhesive on the brain. Our Mortar Ultimate 6 Plus, you can use it for glass and intermittent water exposure areas. But at some point it gets large enough that the thermal expansion contraction of glass, because I don't know if you guys know, glass is one of the least dimensionally stable of the tile products that are out there. If you ever want to see a tile really, really move, get black glass out in Arizona in the middle of summer, and A, it will fry an egg, and B, you'll really be able to see you'll be able to measure the differences. So we typically, and I know a lot of other manufacturers might put limitations on the size. So for Ultimate 6 Plus, you can't use anything larger than it's basically 16 square inches. So there just tend to start being some limitations due to the thermal expansion you see with glass. And due to the fact that glass is very difficult to bond to. Again, I'm not saying that's all mortars. I'm not saying that all of them have those limitations, but it is something to be aware of, that just because an adhesive or a mortar can stick glass doesn't mean it can stick any type of glass in any scenario. You're going to need to probably do a little bit more research before just picking one that says, oh yeah, you could do glass. You know what I mean?
Find out what kind of glass, for sure. Yeah. Okay. How does the bond strength of MS adhesives compare to the strongest mortars, also coverage and price?
So I'm going to tell you that I can tell you what they are in newtons per meter squared, which does not translate over. So that is something that if you're curious about, let me know and I'll do the conversion. I don't know off the top of my head. I will also say that the ISO standard is a little bit different than the ANSI standard. So in ANSI, we're very concerned with what's called shear strength, which basically is when you take two tile and you put them between a press and you shear it, okay? ISO is a lot more concerned typically with pull, okay? So they'll actually get like a pull test to see how well bonded is it to the substrate. And I wish I could tell you that shear strength and a pull strength is the exact same thing and the numbers match up and you can do a perfect comparison, but it's not quite that easy. So like I said, I can get the numbers over to you in the standard once I do a conversion, but know that because of the way they test, it's a little bit different. And so it doesn't always translate perfectly well.
Heather, why don't we do this? Let's give, are you okay if we give out your email address if someone wants to email you and ask you?
Yeah, that's fine. Yes.
Okay, while you answer the next one, I'll type it in and send it to all. So, all right, our next question is, let's see here. Do you know the difference in cost per square foot between the MS and traditional mortars? So that same question. All right. Well, we'll definitely get your
Yeah, I'm going to tell you, I'm not in sales, and that means that I do not have a perfect per square foot cost comparison. And again, there are other MS adhesives out there that I wouldn't want to speak for other manufacturers as well, due to the labor savings and the fact that, again, with ours, you don't have to do a dual code application. Typically, you're going to find it's probably going to be more expensive, but it's not just totally out of this world more expensive because you're not having to do a dual code application.
Okay. More coverage considerations, and then is there a max trowel notch size for the MS? I think they're asking.
Yeah, we do have a maximum embedded thickness. I would have to pull that one up. I don't know that one off the top of my head. But similar to mortars, we do have a maximum that you are allowed to build it up to before it's just too much.
Okay. What does I don't know who Heath is, but what does Heath think are the bigger topics coming up at TECINA handbook meeting? Somewhat off topic. We're going off topic here. So
I mean, I'm gonna hope that we're gonna talk about adhesives at that meeting. So I mean, if I were to be a guessing, I would say guessing man, guessing lady. I'm gonna guess that adhesives are gonna be a topic, but I don't know. Yeah.
I
I
don't
would
know.
not make any promises.
All right. I love these questions. I didn't listen to all of the programs, so if this was covered, is there a maximum trowel depth allowed? So thickness with all the adhesives. Yeah. So yes, we just went through that again. And what kind of, oh, here we go. What sort of coverage requirement can be expected with the newer MS adhesives?
Yeah, so it's going to be similar to a traditional mortar, but what I will say is you have to have a flat substrate. You know what I mean? If you are doing that single coat application, I mean, your substrate preparation has to be on point. And if it's not, you're going to have a bad time. This product does actually have enough suction to it that I've seen. If you put some of the thinner panels, and any of you guys that have worked with the panels know that they can actually bend a little bit. I've seen it installed on an area that was maybe a little concave, and it actually like suctioned it into the wall because it has so much grab. So you still have to make sure that you've got the proper substrate prep. Otherwise, you're again kind of going outside of industry standards in a couple different ways.
Substrate prep is one of the very important parts of installing tile and stone for sure, and glass, very much so. Do you have engineering done for how large of a tile and how high for tile installations?
Yeah, so I will tell you some of that does default to building codes. So we have done, for example, on the height, so we have submitted and been successful with getting some building code variances. In the end, though, that is going to be very specific to the area you're installing in and what the building inspectors and the permit office will or won't allow. And again, we can always supply information around what the ISO standard is and what these types of adhesives do, but you have to default to industry standards for code reasons, which means that I'm sure out there are going to be some inspectors that will say that no, we don't feel comfortable, we're not going to allow this to go up beyond what the IBC code that I showed is. And then as far as size goes, I mean, really, we're talking gauge porcelain panels. We've installed it with 5 foot by 10 foot. The biggest thing to be aware of is the bigger the tile, again, you have to make sure that you have enough moisture in the adhesive to cure, which goes back to that spritzing it down, right? Making sure that you've given the substrate a drink as you get to those bigger tile, because you need to make sure that the moisture in the air and in the ambient conditions can actually reach the center. So that's the only kind of thing to be aware of when you're doing it with the larger tile. But as far as limitations go on porcelain, I mean, we're doing the 5 foot by 10 foot. Glass, we are a little bit pickier on that. Right now we've tested up to the 2 foot by 4 foot for interior applications and feel very comfortable with it. But we have not been able to test anything larger on an exterior to date. So that's kind of the biggest we allow for glass. So it does somewhat depend on the type of tile.
All right, next question. Is there anything beside VOCs consumers should know about adhesives? And the context for this question is an article about why tile installation contractors may increase or reduce their labor costs based on the material selection, including setting materials. This is not about square foot cost. This is about difficulty of ease, the difficulty or ease of installation. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
it does a little bit, and that was a long enough question. I hope I'm going to answer this right. I'm going to tell you guys a story about a contractor we actually had up in Canada. So we're going to go a little bit outside of the US for this story. They had such strict silica regulations on a job site that they could not mix or cut their tile on site.
Wow.
They legitimately, and this is no joke, had to drive their vehicle off the job site with a generator to mix and cut and then bring everything once mixed back on the job site. So you can bet that if we would have had this product when they were doing that installation, they would have said that, please, because they wouldn't have been dealing with the silica regulations. So I do think that there really is something to be said about the products that you're using and the safety standards that exist can sometimes impact what your costs are going to be. Now, again, I know that's an extreme case. Trust me, like I get that that's not happening on every job site, but it does kind of give an example of how, you know, if you have an area where that's going to be the requirement that you can't cut or grind or mix thin set, even with dust collection on site, you can imagine how much time that contractor spent trucking all their stuff and running a generator off site. Yeah.
No, I can't even imagine.
Yeah, right. It's not, oh, when I got told about it, I went, you what? But
All right. Are MS adhesives the future or just another option? What's your thought?
personally, I think that they are going to be just another option. I could easily see them replacing things like Mastics just due to the ease of use. Right now, we're definitely still in like the new phase. It would definitely be a major change because I'll be honest, when we train on this, if you're expecting it to feel like a mortar, it doesn't, right? So if
Right.
you're used to the mortar feel, you like how mortar feels, it's very different working with an MS adhesive, just in the feel of it and the fact that you can't mix to consistency. So the advantage to mortar that we didn't really talk about is you can mix based off of, you know, what your application is. If you want it a little thicker, you want it a little thinner. The MS adhesive is what it is in the bucket, right? And ours, in order to hit that non-sag, non-slump, it's got quite a bit of body to it, much more than a mastic would, right? But if you're doing a floor, for example, you know, this is a product actually you can't, I don't know if I mentioned it, you can't really use this product on floors. It's a limitation that we have. Hypothetically, though, if you were using an MS on a floor, depending on the product, it might be too thick or it might be too thin, depending on whose you're using. And you could just, you know, have Popeye arms for something that if you were using mortar, you could have just mixed at the high end of the water range and had a very easy time spreading on the floor. You know what I mean? And again, the flip side being, if you're going up a wall, you can adjust it to be a little bit thicker, so you're a little bit cleaner in what you're doing. It is definitely a very specific type of application. The MS adhesive that we have and the reason that we meet an ISO standard is actually because it was designed for glass and pool. Not everyone's putting, you know, that's not, I wouldn't say that's 80% of the jobs that are going out there, right? And it might be overkill, honestly, you know, and I think that there is something to be said for fit to purpose and having something that is fit to purpose. These might be overkill for some of the jobs that are being done. And there's no reason to make things more difficult or make things more expensive just to do it. You know what I mean?
So I do want to clarify something in what you have just said, and please tell me if I'm right or wrong here, but I'm of the belief you should follow the manufacturer's recommendation for how much
Yeah.
water to use in a
Oh,
motor.
yes. Yes. I'm not saying mix outside of the water range.
Track motor. Use exactly what they're telling you, right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we always give ranges for all of our mortars, right? So again, you can mix it thicker or looser. That does not mean that you should mix it to a soup-like consistency. Other similar things I like to remind people is it needs to be clean water. I think one of the favorite calls we've ever gotten is that someone grabbed water out of a pond in Florida that an alligator was living in and wondered why their white grout was a little green. You know what I mean? There are considerations for where you're getting your water, and like you said, Jim, how much water are you adding?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
I
we
just
give
wanted to be
directions for
clear.
that.
I wanted to
Yes.
make sure I was clear.
Yes, no, thank you.
All right. Is the 330 feather okay to use for floor prep under the MS?
Yes, it would
Okay.
be. If you're provided that you're using it, it's an interior only product. It does have some limitations around how thick it goes, but yes, feather edge could be used for that.
This is great. We got a lot of good questions. So what is the open time and pot life of this material, the MS? And
So
I'm
because,
going to read the whole question to you, and then I'll let you answer it in sections, I think. Is there risk of skinning over if there is a delay after troweling or with windy conditions? or HVAC blowing on the troweled substrate, air conditioning kind of a thing?
Okay, so let me go back to the
First
beginning,
part,
and I
first
hope I
part.
remember all of the questions that you just
Pot
asked me.
life, open time and pot life.
Okay, so open time, I believe, is going to be up to 60 minutes, but it's going to depend on your conditions. And again, if you've got really humid conditions, it might start skinning over a little bit sooner. It doesn't have a pot life because it's ready to use in the bucket, right? So it's ready to use, and I'll tell you what, if you put the lid back on it, it'll still be good tomorrow, right?
Okay,
So the
that's
pot life is kind of a, I would say, not really an applicable thing for this type of a product. But if you do get the skin over the surface, like I said, peel the skin off. The adhesive is still good underneath it, right? So you can definitely use this product the next day. If you open a bucket and you only use half of it or a quarter of it, put the lid back on it. Ideally cover it in plastic just to minimize air exposure, and you can just use it the next day. Yeah.
I think the question is more if you troweled it out.
Right.
You,
So so the next thing is, yes, if you did trowel it out, there is, I mean, similar to mortar, it is susceptible to the fact that it could skin over. The nice thing though is it is a little bit the opposite of what you would see with mortar, that normally with mortar, if it's hot and dry, hot and dry, it will skin over faster. This one, it'll actually, when it's dry conditions, have a little bit longer working time because it needs that moisture, right? Again, if you're in Florida and it's summer and it's 100% humidity, skinning over is, you know, again, it's similar to mortar in that it is a real thing that you need to be aware of. The nice thing though is, again, if you spritz it down, you're basically telling it when it should start really reacting. But you do still need to be aware of your humidity, and it doesn't give you a free pass just to not check those things.
oh, that's great. All right, looks like our last question. MS adhesives can be used on natural stone, correct? Or not?
So if it's moisture sensitive, like an epoxy, currently we wouldn't recommend it for like a moisture sensitive natural stone,
Yeah,
just due to the
green marble
potential.
or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So
So it would be great for onyx. It'd be great for granite, and then be careful with some of your marbles, right?
yep.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Well, I have to say this was a great webinar on some new topics and new information, and I appreciate it, Heather. I want to thank everyone for attending today. Great attendance. Look forward to our next webinar on the 27th of this month, so next week, actually a couple weeks. And thank you for attending. I appreciate it. Thank you, Heather, for a great job. Fantastic presentation. So everybody have a great rest of your week and weekend, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Bye, everyone.